Hi. So, my TA, Tuffy, and I are here to talk a bit about Russian, Soviet, and post Soviet history. So, all right. Stalin dies. That's a good thing. The key point here is that there is never again a time of true totalitarianism in the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin. The idea of millions of people being killed, going to gulags, going through that system, his terror, his purges of the government, that never happens again. That's not to say that Soviet history does not have repression, does not have human rights abuses, does not have terrible prison systems, does not, right, I mean, so, but there's nothing like Stalin's dictatorship and its violence ever again. Stalin is replaced by Khrushchev. This is reaching a little farther back than you probably need to know, but since we're doing this. Stalin is replaced by Khrushchev. He is sort of an interesting figure. His sort of big act upon the death of Stalin is to denounce him, to denounce Stalinism and what he calls his personality cult, to say that the Soviet Union veered wildly away from Marxism-Leninism under his reign, under his control, and that the need was to de-Stalinize, to get back to the original principles of the founding of the USSR. Now, there's a certain irony to this because Khrushchev had himself worked within Stalin's Soviet bureaucracy, had been very effective in it for many years, managed to survive in it, and that's why he found himself in the position to be in charge of the Soviet Union upon Stalin's death. That being said, Khrushchev, he did want to reform. He initiated what's called the Thaw. This was after they pulled Stalin's corpse out of Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square. And if you want to think about Soviet history in a sort of more complex way, people spoke, regular people spoke at that sort of decommissioning ceremony. And this little old lady gets up among other people and she says, "I survived Stalin because I had Lenin in my heart." So an important thing to think about as we think about Soviet history is the fact that it's not just one mass of like communism, but repression. I mean, it's the people that lived through it made distinctions, and there were distinctions, and made these kinds of gradations, right? So this idea that now we're going to return to an original sort of Leninism, we're going to go back to that Bolshevik era now that we have de-Stalinified the country, right? So that's sort of what's going on. And Khrushchev begins to try reforms, particularly reforms to agriculture. This period is called the Thaw. He allows some loosening of censorship on journalists, but also on artists and writers. He comes to America. He's wildly popular. He's literally the son and grandson of peasants, and he has that. He'll go out into the crowd and he'll shake hands and he'll kiss babies. He's a wildly popular figure in the USSR for a long time. The reforms didn't always work. But he met with a great deal of resistance within the party, and eventually the party removes him from power. After his removal from power, they give him an apartment, they pay him a stipend, and that's it for the rest of his life. We go to Brezhnev, and then we have this era that is called stagnation. This term is meant to apply to the economy of the Soviet Union. Is actually coined by Mikhail Gorbachev in the 80s. But it also refers in many ways to just the whole situation. There's a lot of potential reasons to think about why the Soviet economy stagnated. One is that it was being ruled by repressive bureaucrats, sort of, petty, simple-minded people, to be perfectly honest, ancient, conservative, fluctuations in the global economy, bad central planning, corruption, et cetera, right? It's particularly bad for consumer goods. This becomes a problem increasingly through the 80s. It's something that the Soviet people get madder and madder about. It's also something that, as we'll see, this kind of scarcity of things that people need shapes the way people think about their everyday lives, the way artists, the way writers think and talk about the world, this problem of scarcity in this era. So we go through stagnation. We kind of limp along through the Cold War. The Soviet space program starts to fail. This is a whole decline. And really what that gets us up to is Gorbachev. Starting in 1986. He's relatively young. We have got that Brezhnev finally dies. Doesn't know where he is by the time he goes. There's this interregnum where we have these two other, it's called the gerontocracy. We have these two other ancient old men barely running the country throughout the early 80s. Meanwhile, in America, Reagan comes to power and really reamps the Cold War. He starts increasing American military spending, and these old men in charge of the Soviet Union think they necessarily, therefore, have to increase military spending in the USSR. Well, there had already been scarcity problems with consumer goods, and now that more and more of the economic production of the Soviet Union is being directed towards militarization, it becomes harder and harder for common people to get even the basic necessities of life. And one thing that starts to happen at this point in the 80s is that you get this massive underground market. It's a bit of gangsterism, frankly. Let's call it the illegitimate economy, because there's no other way to get things. And so this, too, is sort of people that come of age in the 80s. Someone like myself, who's born in the early 80s, people that, now are the writers and artists and so forth of the Soviet Union. This also shapes their perceptions as they write, right? This sort of endless problem of like, oh, now my appliance is broken down and for some reason I've got to go talk to a shady guy in an alley about it, right? As opposed to just buying one. So eventually Gorbachev comes to power, criticizing this stagnation, criticizing this exacerbation of the Cold War. He introduces two main important policies to think about: perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika is the restructuring of the government. Now, Gorbachev's main goal is to preserve the Soviet Union and to preserve the Communist Party. However, he thinks the only way to do that is to open the Soviet Union up to the world, is to reform and liberalize some of its internal markets, to have greater freedom, to have greater democracy. He thinks that's what will save the Soviet Union. So he initiates economic reforms and liberalizations that are a little beyond our scope. But he also initiates glasnost, which is this opening up. And one of the things that's opened is government archives. It seems strange to think about this now, but there are many people alive in the 80s in the Soviet Union that, because of the effective repression of the country's real history, had no idea the things Stalin had done, did not know about those slave labor camps, or certainly not to their extent, did not know how many millions of people died, did not know. And so this starts to come out, and it causes a fair amount of chaos in Russian culture. And so this moment, too, if we think about what are the sort of cultural effects on the people who are artists and writers at the time who go on to be, this moment of discovery, terrible, terrible discovery, and it actually really destabilizes the country. Meanwhile, politically, you had already had Poland break away the business with solidarity. It's this other part of history. We could talk about Lech Walesa sometime. Other Soviet republics sort of see their chance and start to break away themselves, starting in 1988. And to Gorbachev's credit, he lets them go, right? Because the alternative would have been rolling the military in to try to preserve the Soviet Union geographically, and, thousands and thousands of people would have died. He lets them go. We get the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. One thing that we do get during this period is the freest elections in Soviet history. We do get a freer environment to make movies, to write, to produce art. All of that is true, but it's all so destabilizing that, the center cannot hold. The particular political details are beyond our scope. The point is that Gorbachev is forced to resign. He goes on TV. Imagine this. Imagine living through this. He goes on TV and he says the Soviet Union is dissolved, right? So the leader of your country comes on the television, announces his resignation, and announces that the country does not exist anymore. That's tremendous, right? It's a tremendous experience to live through. So let's talk about Boris Yeltsin. I have nothing good to say about Boris Yeltsin. He was a corrupt drunk who destroyed his country. Other people might disagree with me, but they're not giving this little video lecture. So Yeltsin was elected to parliament. He actually became popular with the people because during Gorbachev's reign, there was an attempted coup from the right, a right-wing coup against Gorbachev and his reforms. Tanks roll up to the White House. That's what they call the parliament building in Russia. And Yeltsin, who is a younger guy, goes out there, stands up against the tanks, and people correctly see this as protecting democracy. They had free and pretty fair elections. There was a new parliament in place. There were reforms taking place that people were interested in, that people wanted to see happen. And so Yeltsin goes out there and stands in front of this tank and sort of thwart the right-wing coup against Gorbachev, and he becomes a popular politician out of all of this. Fine and fair. What comes later in his history, therefore, is sort of all the more upsetting. So let's think about America for a second. Let's think about the West in general. Obviously, because of the Cold War, the West has been rooting for the downfall of the Soviet Union for a long, long time. At the time, throughout the 1980s, and honestly throughout the 1990s too, there was a particular way that the United States, chiefly through U.S. aid, also through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which America largely controls, even though they're international organizations, were handling these kinds of crises in foreign countries. Now, in general, the IMF and the World Bank, like the UN, had been formed after World War II to try to preserve stability in the world. There's representatives from all these different governments, right? It's meant to come in with cash provided by member states to try to keep crisis-ridden states stable, whatever. It was the opinion, it was called the Washington Consensus. It was the opinion at this time, in the 1980s, and frankly in the 1970s, and like I said, throughout the 1990s, the Washington Consensus that the best thing to do to a country in crisis is to force it at the time, because that's when it's vulnerable to massive changes, to force it to undergo what were commonly called structural readjustment programs. And structural readjustment programs meant that the economy would be reformed to the utmost of laissez-faire capitalism. So, no regulations on wages, no regulations on working conditions, no regulations on environmental protections, no protections whatsoever for the national market, so just fling the doors open to any kind of international investment, ultimate privatization, flat, low taxes, and also deprivatization within the state, or not deprivatization, privatization within the state itself. So the tearing down of public social safety nets, any kind of public government service, and replacing that with privatization, even public schools, even, anything like this. So this Friedmanism, this radical laissez-faire capitalism, far more unregulated than, even anything we have in America, right, was to be instituted through these structural readjustment programs, and countries were forced to take them if they wanted any financial aid at all. And, of course, they needed financial aid as their countries collapsed. We had gone through something, I mentioned Poland earlier, so Poland had gone through something similar just a few years prior in the 1980s. There had been a peaceful revolution, basically, against Soviet power in Poland, at which point these organizations, USAID, IMF, World Bank, step in and say that they will help to stabilize the country with outside funds, but only if the structural readjustment program is accepted. The same thing happened in Russia. Here's the problem, though. The people of Poland, and also the people of Russia, did not want this. They wanted an end to communism. They wanted an end to Soviet centralized planning and control of the economy. That much is true. They were looking forward to having greater freedom, greater contact with world markets. They wanted all of that. But in general, what people wanted from their government, according to polls at the time, was what we would kind of call democratic socialism. They did not want to see an end to publicly funded education or healthcare. They did not want to see massive outside investment in their country, right? They wanted to keep, Russian companies in Russia. They wanted worker-controlled workplaces, right? So instead of the government centrally planning and controlling the economy, they wanted workers to have control over their workplaces, right? So if you see polls at the time about, what kind of reforms you want now that we're reforming the Soviet Union, now that we can rebuild it, it's things like this, right? They want greater freedom. They certainly want greater democracy. They want greater access to outside markets, but they want it in terms that still sort of protect the people, right? Well, that's not on offer. Boris Yeltsin takes over the country. He accepts every possible part of that structural readjustment program. He has to destroy the country's democratic institutions to do it. There is a new and freely elected parliament in Russia. This is in 1993. They don't want any part of his plan. He had talked them into giving him a great deal of latitude to control the government, to sign these foreign agreements with these foreign entities to try to get... And at first, because he was known as this popularizing... or this popular figure, he was known as somebody who had defended freedom, etc., they agree. They sign this kind of power over to him to allow him to sort of unilaterally make these deals with the international community. When they find out what these deals are, they, revolt, basically. They're like, this is not what people elected us to provide them. This is not what people want. He first shuts off all the power and water to the parliament. They decide, first he tries to dissolve the parliament. There's no real... it would be like dissolving Congress. There's no legal mechanism to do it, but he does it anyway. They refuse to go. He turns off power and water to the building. They still refuse to go. It is a mass peaceful protest of the elected government. People come out into the streets to support them, start, bringing them food and water, etc. And at this point, Yeltsin goes complete dictator and rolls in tanks and fires on... the White House, fires on the Russian parliament. This would be like if the president rolled up tanks and started firing on Congress. That's what happened. The structural adjustment programs are pushed through, and it is chaos in Russia thereafter, throughout the 1990s. The only thing that Yeltsin does is maintain Russian businesses as they are privatized, because of course everything had been state-held. As they are privatized, he does not open them up to multinational purchase. He keeps that in-country. And so there you see basically that he's giving away massive state industries to his friends. People wake up billionaires, and this is the rise of the Russian oligarchy that you've heard about. As part of the privatization programs, what had been a good public healthcare system and a good public education system, public support for the arts, they just collapse, and there's nothing to replace them. The ruble itself collapses because of weird international finance market tradings in the currency now that that's allowed. There is massive unemployment. The suicide rate jumps. The divorce rate jumps. The abortion rate jumps. Alcoholism and drug use skyrocket. There is an AIDS epidemic. There is a tuberculosis epidemic. The average life expectancy of a Russian man in the 1990s drops 7 years. Statistically, that's incredible. That's just... wow. The ruble collapses again in 1998. So throughout the immediate post-Soviet era, and if we want to think about writers and artists who, they sort of get opportunities in the Glasnost era in the 1980s, they've been, born and raised under stagnation, and now here is this post-Soviet period it is a time of societal collapse, and the only thing that rises at this time is a few billionaires and, frankly, massive gangsterism, because that underground illegitimate economy just expands. I said massive unemployment. Nobody has any savings anymore. It's a mess. The country is a mess. Which, frankly, to carry this a little further than we needed to go, explains the popularity of Vladimir Putin. He comes to power in 1999 after, as the sort of security, as the law and order candidate, after a series of incredibly violent and unexpected attacks, terrorist attacks on apartment buildings in Moscow. Hundreds of people die. If you want to Google this, there is a massive and not crazy conspiracy theory that actually the Russian government perpetrated those attacks themselves. I'm not necessarily saying that happened. I'm just saying it's a wiki hole. Anyway, he comes to power and he restores stability in the Soviet Union. I keep saying that. It's a Freudian slip. Putin restores stability in Russia. The population stops declining the way it had been. He reinstitutes basic public health and safety programs. The currency stabilizes. People get back to work. Now, there's massive inequality in the country now. Russia is now one of the most unequal places in the world between the rich and the poor. There's many more poor and unemployed people than there ever were during the Soviet years. Putin himself is one of the oligarchs. He himself personally is a billionaire. A lot of journalists die and go missing, right? The rise of terrible anti-LGBTQ sentiment that he uses as a political weapon. But, I mean, if you want to think about Russian politics of today, why they accept this strongman, it's because in many ways the country was in a free fall, and he stopped it, and he helped people. And if you want to think about why there is so much anti-Western sentiment in Russia today, people rightly understood that the West had forced on them a political and economic program upon the end of the Soviet Union that they did not want, and that caused chaos and catastrophe in their country for they and themselves and their families, right? And so that lingers, and that's just a historical fact. So this is the historical situation that brings us to our authors this week, right? As I said, people that were, born under stagnation, kind of emerged as writers and artists during the Glasnost era and within the post-Soviet era, and are now, of course, so heavily shaped and influenced by these historic events. So we will talk about those in another little video. But that is that, and all right, have a good day.